Earlier this summer, I found this wonderful sewing pattern from 1946. It's for this dress with a gathered bust detail as well as gathering below the waist, which makes it a super flattering pattern, especially with the drop waist because it keeps the waistline clear. It's also really interesting how we see this pattern in 1946 because this gathered bust sort of situation becomes a lot more common in the 1950s. The only difference is usually the bottom piece, I don't know what it's called, I'm just going to call it a yoke, is curved the other way. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting design and I had to have it. The original pattern was a Hollywood pattern, and considering they went out of business the same year this pattern was released, it was unlikely that I was going to be able to find it to purchase. In fact, the only place on the internet where it was the Vintage Pattern Wiki, and they unfortunately don't post pictures of the backs of their patterns, so I didn't have access to any information like yardages, suggested fabrics, and most importantly, the shapes of the pattern pieces. Luckily, the design was quite simple, so I was able to figure it out with my rudimentary pattern drafting skills. I started with a tracing of the front of my block pattern, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a basic pattern that fits your body perfectly. I'm coincidentally working on my own blue patterning table of doom, just like the closet historian who makes the best vintage pattern drafting videos. Highly recommend, she's taught me everything I know about drafting. So first, I drew out where I wanted the top edge to be, just so that the darts I'm going to move don't manipulate where I want it to lay. I don't know about you guys, but I'm still disappointed that the Hollywood Patterning Company went out of business. I think their designs were really cool, though I've never worked with one of their patterns, so I can't vouch for their instructions or fit. Now I'm going to move the dart fullness from the bottom dart into the side. I thought moving the entire fullness made the dart look bigger than it should be, so I didn't move at all, which was the root of all my fit issues in this dress. One of my favorite parts of dart manipulation, even though it screwed me over in this project, is that you have to follow all the rules and trust it, and if you do, it cannot fail. So I basically just filled that in with paper and arbitrarily decided a point for the dart that seemed right to me. As I said, I'm a floundering beginner when it comes to things like this. Since I'd finished messing with the top dart, I could cut away everything I didn't need along the line I drew earlier. Then I was able to cut off the bottom yoke piece, forming a top lining piece that will mount the bust gathering to, and then we'll sew both those layers to the yoke. If that doesn't make any sense, you'll see when I do it. And I'm drafting net without seam allowance, Victorian style. It saves on tape, and all you have to do is remember to add it as you cut. As you can see in the original pattern and the sketch, we don't want the gathering to go all the way to the side seam because it just won't look very good, so I'm going to draw a line on my piece where I want the gathering to stop. When we double the size of the bust piece in order to have volume to gather it, we're going to leave this section intact and not stretch it. Speaking of the gathered piece, we're going to do that now, starting by roughly tracing the lining piece. I'm holding the dart closed as I trace because obviously we can't put the dart in the gathers. All of its shaping will be absorbed, so to speak, by the gathers. They'll just stretch to fit in the places where extra volume is needed. I'm going to cut it out with a little bit of allowance along the top and bottom because I want the gathers to be kind of puffy and not taut to the lining. Next, I'm going to double the size of this piece so that we'll have volume to gather down. It's a rather simple shape, so I drew a line every inch or so, then I cut along those lines, except for the area by the side seam that we marked earlier. Then I could tape the strips down onto another piece of paper, spacing them evenly so that it would be double the original length. Of course, if you were doing this with a more complicated pattern piece, I'd be more careful in measuring out smaller strips and regulating the distance between them in order to preserve the shape as well as possible. After I was done with all three front pieces, I could begin working on the back. I wanted to raise it a little bit from the original so that I could do shoulder straps instead of a halter style, so I took some of the back panels I drafted from an evening gown and traced them. I've probably teased it before, but I'm working on a late 1940s-ish evening gown and I'm nearly done. All I have to do is the hem, so that video's coming soon. There's a dipped back on the bodice of the evening gown, so I just got rid of that when tracing for this project, and also made sure the heights of the panels aligned with the front pieces. This is the fabric I chose. It's a small cotton gingham that's textured like a seersucker. Towards the second half of the 40s, ginghams and patterns in general tended to be rather large, but unfortunately large gingham fabrics aren't that common today, so I had to go with a small one. I didn't iron it so that all the puckers would be preserved when I cut it, which would keep it from shrinking down after washing and having to be ironed again. Here you can see me cutting out all my pattern pieces, keeping plenty of room between them so that I could add my half-inch seam allowance. As I'm writing this, it's the 1st of September and everyone is starting to talk about autumn, and here I am still working on my summer projects. I mean, last year it was October by the time I finished, so it could be worse. But I still have one more dress to make and I'm planning on making a video on it, so we'll see if I get it done. Summer is my favorite season, so I always like doing seasonal projects. Last year I made the 1950s dress that I absolutely love, but the fabric I chose unfortunately frays a lot, so I can't wear it a ton. If you're a beginner at sewing, make it a priority to learn about fabrics because they could make or break your project. Like for example, don't use cotton canvas to make a dress like I did. But it's still one of my favorite videos on my channel. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. Highly underrated in my opinion. Anyway, after cutting out all the bodice pieces, I cut some shoulder straps. I thought I would match the small gingham to make them rather narrow, so I cut 1.5-inch strips to create half-inch straps once the seam allowance is taken out. And I'm planning to trim them to length, so I just cut more than I needed. I seem to have lost the footage, but I also cut a gathered skirt that was a little less than double my waist measurement. Then I cut some facings for the back pieces from my scraps. The front doesn't need them because we're lining the gathered piece, which acts similarly. Now we can finally begin sewing, starting with marking the darts on the bodice lining piece. Being my own pattern, I purposely didn't bother with notches and small, medium, and large O's because I find them really annoying to mark. Bad sewing practices, I know. I'm then gonna pin and sew the darts. The lighting in these shots is great, too bad it's so hard to get it consistently. I filmed the pattern drafting bits in the evening, that's why the lighting was absolute garbage. Most people have probably left at this point because who wants to look at not pretty footage? If you're still around, then hi. Then I sewed the center seam. I could have cut this piece on the fold, but it wasn't going to be seen anyway and it makes the cutting layouts easier. The next step was to gather the bust piece. I marked the line I drew earlier so that I would know where to stop the gathering threads, then installed said gathering threads using 2 lines. You'll see when I pull the threads, but a double line helps the gathers lie straighter in neither. You should be seeing hand-drawn representations of everything I'm doing as I do it, in case anything I say isn't making sense. I remember when I was first starting out, even now still if I'm not paying attention, I would get so lost when watching sewing videos because sometimes it's hard to visualize something if all you have is a voiceover explaining it, and sometimes it's hard to see even in the fabric. Anyway, you've been watching me pin the gathered piece to the lining along the top edge and pull the gathering threads. I stroked all the gathers with a pin to help them lay as flat as possible, but I didn't film it because it took an eternity and it's very slow and tedious. Now I've sewn the gathered piece to the lining and I'm removing the stroking pins and clipping the edge so that it sits flatter. The rest of the bodice came together pretty quickly. I basted the lower edges of the lining and the gathered piece together after stroking the gathers and all that, then stitched it to the bottom yoke piece. Then I just sewed the front to the side backs and the side backs to the backs. Sorry I didn't capture much footage of it, but I actually tried on the bodice and found it a bit large, as if, I don't know, I was missing some fullness from my dart. It wasn't really something I could fix, so I basically took the entire thing apart and took about 1/2 inch out of the center seam of the lining piece, and that pretty much fixed it. After sewing it all back together, I could do the facings. I sewed the back facing to the side back, then both facings to the top edge of the bodice, overlapping the facing with the bust lining by 1/2 inch so that I could turn it in neatly and leave no edges exposed. I also top stitched the facing so that the edge would be as clean as possible. At this point, I decided to run another gathering thread along the top edge of the bodice because it wouldn't quite lay flat, and I think it really helped in neatening up the appearance. While I'm doing that, I'd like to direct your attention to this amazing music. It was actually written by my friend Carter, who happens to have a YouTube channel here that focuses on music, and there's a lot of composing content, covers, jazz improv, stuff like that, so I would really appreciate it if you checked it out. I decided to do the straps next, which I folded in half, pinned, and stitched into tubes. I think it would have been so cool to see Hollywood patterns of famous later movie stars in dresses. I know they made patterns of some of the costumes from Gone with the Wind, so imagine if we could get, say, Audrey Hepburn's Roman holiday outfit, or the black dress from Breakfast at Tiffany's, or the pink dresses that Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell wore in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. I feel like for me though, it wouldn't be about the sewing pattern, like the context of Audrey's Roman holiday outfit is what makes it iconic, not the style itself, but it would have been more cool to see the branding and have the physical envelope with that piece of history on it. Get what I mean? Anyway, you've been watching me trim down the seam allowances on the straps, turn them inside out using the safety pin trick, and begin hand stitching them to the bodice. I could have inserted them into these top edge seams, but laziness. Besides, I think the hand stitched details look kind of cute. Now that the bodice is completely finished, we can begin the skirt. Just like with the bust piece, I gathered the top edge of the skirt with 2 lines of gathering stitches. Then I pulled the threads and pinned the skirt to the bodice, stroking the gathers. Then I stitched the waist seam. The panel I cut for the skirt was a little narrow, so in order to stride comfortably, I had to cut it to knee length before hemming. We'll just say it's a remnant from wartime fabric rationing here in 46 and call it historical accuracy. But I have to say, these rectangular skirts are so easy to hem. No trying to ease out the volume like in circular gored skirts. With that, the dress is finished. I have to say, this is one of my favorite things I've ever made, and I've gotten a lot of wear out of it already. There aren't really many faults, which is quite rare for something I've made. Kind of interesting how a dress like this could pass for modern, yet was taken nearly exactly from a vintage pattern. Alright, well this was a particularly rambly voiceover. Feel free to subscribe if you're into vintage fashion and sock plushies. Weird combination I know, but that's what this channel is about. And I'll see you guys next time.